Hi, everybody. Welcome to class 9 of environmental law. So, this week we're going to talk about water. We're going to be talking about history of water environmental laws, then specifically get into the Clean Water Act, and then some other stuff about water and about keeping it clean and usable. So, our little quote. Many have lived without love, but not one without water. So, just like air, right? The two things we really need are air and water, and keeping them clean is a pretty big priority. Okay, so our water, when we're talking about water, things or terms you might come across are surface water, right? So that's the water above the ground, lakes, rivers, oceans, all of that stuff. Um, might also talk about navigable waters. So navigable waters are things that you can, put a boat on or a barge or something like that, from a canoe to a cruise ship. And then groundwater, so that's the water beneath the surface. So all of that stuff can be important, can be regulated, things like that. We do know that water goes across state lines, so therefore it can be subject to interstate commerce. You can pollute water directly by putting something right into there, or indirectly by things like, acid rain or seepage or things like that. So, and similar to the Clean Air Act, water has been the regulation of water and anti pollution of water has gone on through the years. So it's kind of a patchwork. So, start out with some laws and then they're amended. So it gets a little confusing, but, we're going to make it, we're going to get through. Okay. So, before our even thinking about our tradition or our modern or current environmental laws, we might want to talk about riparian rights. So the riparian rights, I remember in law school, you can go back to this stuff. It's all very concrete information that or law that makes sense. You have uh, someone who lives by a river and they use that river to maybe irrigate their fields, and then upstream there's like a pig farmer and then their pigs are like pooping in the river, and then the river is no longer potable. Or somebody upstream does something like, hey, I'm going to dam up this river, and then I have a lake, and then you have just a trickle. So that has been litigated and argued for centuries upon centuries. So just some of the terms here, riparian rights are the rights of landowners that own land right next to a body of water, and their rights to use that body of water. Okay, so it usually deals with navigable waters, like anything that you can take a boat on. Um, and then you own the property. So think of like a river or something. So under the water to the center of that river. And if you're traditionally riparian rights, you can make reasonable use of the water. Okay. So reasonable use, that's a balancing test, right? You have your right to use it balanced against the interest to the general public for the use of that water. Littoral rights, or I don't really know the pronunciation. That's the right of owners of non-flowing water. So if you have like a stream or a lake or something like that, but similar standards. Okay, so your reasonable use depends on how what your use is impacting others. Um, States can limit the owner's rights to either take the water, right, use it for irrigation or drinking or, your factory, or to build structures on the water, right? Maybe you can't build like a big houseboat, or maybe you think about the river boats down in Joliet or Aurora, where it's just like an entire boat or pier built over the river, and then they're like, oh yeah, it's a river boat, so it qualifies. So states can limit, you know, the owners or of these rights, their ability to use, take, and build structures on the water. Um, and then if all the owners, if everybody did whatever they wanted, there wouldn't be enough water. States can, issue what we call allotments to take a portion of the water. So, think about like the old West, right, where you have a river and then people are using it for irrigation or whatever, and there's limits, right? So, states can issue these allotments to take a portion of the water. Just even similarly, like I don't know where you live, but like in the summer, we get notices about the days that you can water your grass, right? Like, so if you're on the even side of the street, you can only water your grass on the even days, odd side, odd days. It's just you're limiting the amount of water you can use. Um, some of these Western states, I've been watching some of those, like the 1883 Yellowstone. So this kind of is hitting home to me. Water rights are ruled by something called prior appropriation. So it's like whoever is upriver or whatever, whoever gets it uses it first. So if you're upriver and you dam the river, okay, that's prior appropriation. And then if you're downriver, you're kind of out of luck. So that kind of the right to use is whoever uh, is upriver gets gets this right. Um, so kind of typo. So water rights, they are separate from the land. So it's not like you don't even have to own the land. You can buy water rights. Separate from the land, and you can sell your water rights to someone. You can, if you're buying water rights, you can use a mortgage or something like that. But that's out west. I mean, water can be a little more scarce out there than it is in the Midwest, where we have a lot of water with our Great Lakes and our rivers and rain, things like that. Um, so, other states have kind of other ways of dealing with water rights. So California, right? Again, California has issues with water, right? So they have droughts, they have mudslides, they have rain, they have a lot of stuff. So California, they use what's called a plural system. So you can get use rights, but you have no ownership of the water itself. Okay, so you can get a right to use it, but you don't own it. So I mean, upshot is laws regarding this water use and ownership, vary from state to state, and a lot of it is depending on like really the value of the water, right? If you're in Nevada, the value of the water is higher than you know Illinois, or a place or Minnesota, right, the land of a thousand lakes, where water is kind of readily available. Um, so that's our riparian right usage. The other thing about just water rights in general is that it's really the purview of the states for their own navigable waters. So there's a doctrine or a kind of a public policy behind it, is that these waters, for their navigable waters, they're held for public use and future use. So the government is obligated, to protect our water, right? To protect the public access, drinking water, um, rights to use it for wildlife, rights that's public access, swimming, all that stuff. So the government has kind of in that police, remember that police power we're talking about in the state's power, to protect this water. And then what they need to do, right? It's a balancing act. Um, the rights of a private citizen to use or enjoy the water versus this public trust. So that's what these state laws do, is they're trying to balance the public trust versus the private the rights of a private person. Okay, so like sometimes they have laws like um, you can there's a public access or a public right to walk along a waterway, right? So if you've ever been to a beach, right, when you're on the beach, you can walk, from property to property along the beach, right? There's like but not everybody has a right to build a house along the water, or you can't put a fish, you might not be able to put a permanent fish trap or put a dock or a pier on the waterway. So like in exhibit 9.1 in the book, they talk about Wisconsin. So in Wisconsin, um, they have a law that you cannot place a structure in the water. Yeah, it's on page 215. So if you want that, then you have to. Oh, yeah. No owner of riparian land that abuts a navigable water may convey any riparian right to anyone else except to walk across the land, um, but you can't place any structure. And then in California, or is this Nevada? Oh, it's Nevada. For Lake Tahoe, no one can construct a pier or a marina on Tahoe or take dredge, right? Remove grain or gravel from Tahoe or fill anything in there, without a permit. So that with the Department of Natural Resources. So anyway, states have the rights on their land. So so that's just kind of like use rights, and now we're kind of going to talking about cleaning it and preserving it for the future. Okay, so before the Clean Water Act, the waters, we saw the Crying Indian our first couple of weeks, but the waters of the United States were maybe kind of a mess. I mean, I grew up along the Hudson River, which was just like a dirty, polluted, terrible, terrible river. Um, the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland literally like went on fire. I mean, can you imagine that? A river being on fire because of, the oil that was on the surface and the dirt that was on the surface. Um, this is the Hudson River, right? Look at that, just like trash. Uh, I remember this, the Clearwater, which was a sailboat that said Clearwater was out there, cleaning up trash and again, just bringing attention to the issue of water pollution uh, to the public lights in the 1970s. So, before clean water, there were some laws, like even back 1899, you couldn't dump into navigable waters. Uh, in 1948, it says waste disposal was a fundamental use of the water, but the responsibility is with the states. Then they started talking about interstate waters, seeing what federal power could be asserted. Uh, Water Quality Act, 1965, where they started to actually introduce standards for water quality for drinking and other uses. Clean Water Restoration Act, 1966, you had to start reporting pollution discharges and penalties for noncompliance. And then Water Quality Improvement Act in 1977. And then here we are, 1972, the Clean Water Act. So it's a little bit after things that we've talked about, like NEPA and clean air. But the purpose is to restore and maintain, basically, the integrity of the waters of the United States. Okay, so what it did, Clean Water Act basically um, regulated what could be dumped or discharged, they call it, into the waters of the United States. Okay, they started to implement standards, wastewater standards, water quality standards, made it unlawful to put a pollutant from a point source, and we'll talk about that in a minute, without a permit. Um, worked on municipal sewage treatment. They encouraged municipalities to create their own sewage treatment plants and gave, low interest or no interest loans to municipalities, and grants for them to do that. Um, and then started to deal with this non-point source solution. So we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so the one first thing, and we talked about this a few weeks ago, is that the Clean Water Act only applies to waters of the United States. Okay, so that's really like waters, interstate waters and their tributaries. Okay, waters that may be used in uh, commerce. And it's been heavily litigated. Okay, so it's, we're not talking about groundwater water here. We're talking about navigable waters, anything that can be used for interstate commerce or that abuts with waters that could be used for interstate commerce. Maybe an arroyo, if you've ever been out west, or to Mexico, you have those dry riverbeds that during the rainy season turn into rivers. Um, Again, interpreted to include wetlands as long as they abut these navigable waters. And if you remember the Swank case, that was the one with the gravel pit in Illinois that was filled up with water, and they were saying, "Oh, it's an interstate water." The Army Corps of Engineers called it a water of the United States because of the Migratory Bird Act, and then the Supreme Court cut that down. And Rampanos was one of those like wetlands. Did he put fill on his own land? And they said no, it's only wetlands that abut waters of navigable waters. So heavily litigated, but again, really, it's either waters that go, like rivers, things that go across state lines and are navigable, but it also includes their tributaries, right? So the little rivers and things that, wetlands and things that abut them. So it's something that you have to look at. Navigable water, right? We talked about that a minute ago. Deep and wide enough to afford passage of ships. So including even like a canoe or a raft, right? That's something. Okay, so the one thing that the Clean Water Act did, it regulated discharging pollutants from what we call a point source. Okay, a point source as opposed to a non-point source. So it's really like one point, right? So it could be a pipe, a ditch, a channel, a well. A floating craft where anything is like discharged. So like one point. Think of that. Um, it includes municipal sewage treatment systems. Okay, right. So your wastewater goes into these water treatment plants, and then it goes back out. Right. So that's a point source. They give this the acronym POTWs, which we'll talk about in a minute or two. Um, but it doesn't include things like stormwater, discharges, return flows, and like things like acid rain, seepage, right? Those would be non-point sources, which I think is my next slide. Okay. Anything that doesn't fit that point source definition, think about when it rains and the water goes into the sewer. Maybe the sewers get overloaded, and then a lot of sewer overload might go into a lake or a river. Um, that's your non-point source. The Water Quality Act, which is another water statute, says that this is not the responsibility of the federal government. States are responsible for their control of this non-point source water pollution, and they have to submit to the EPA what they're doing to reduce this non-point source solution. Okay, so I don't mean to do that. So indirect dischargers. So that would be someone who discharges pollutants into one of these sewage systems, right? Publicly owned public owner treatment works, publicly owned treatment works, which is a sewage treatment system. Okay, that's called an indirect discharger. So what these sewage treatment systems do, they do physical screening, like a literally screening. That's your primary treatment, right? Taking out all the sediment and solid things out of your water. Um, then they would also do secondary treatment. So think about, like they're adding things to purify our water. We have chlorine in our water, right? Some of these POTWs handle industrial waste, and then some, again, handle stormwater. And again, it gets really dangerous when there's heavy rains. Think about, when there's days where after heavy rains, you can't swim in Lake Michigan because of the E. coli. It means like the sewers, the poop got into Lake Michigan. Okay, so that is an indirect discharger. All right, so we're going to stop here, and trying to think about what to. I think you should start working. Your homework is going to be on some of these review questions, and you can go through and see what we've kind of covered already and start working on your review questions. I think we have like 1, 2, and maybe 13. Um, Deal with what we've talked about, so you can go back and answer those questions and look at the book and make sure you're good on our point sources and our non-point sources and our riparian rights and our littoral rights and all of that stuff. And then I will be back.